Hi, I'm Daniela Mellen. Thanks for joining me today. I wanted to show you a quick little use of scraps in your slow stitching. Now, this isn't a finished project per se. These are just little things you can do with your scraps that you can add to your slow stitching. It's something you can do when you have little pieces of fabric that you don't want to part with because they're either particularly beautiful or the colors are just sensational. You combine your scraps, add a few stitches, and then you have an element that you could then add to your slow stitching. It's not necessarily complete on its own, but when introduced to a slow stitching piece and other fabric, it starts the basis of a focal point in your work. And I'll show you how I use it. And the benefit to this project is that when you have creative energy, but you're not really sure how to use it, or maybe you're just in a rut and you don't know what to do, pull out your scraps and just be inspired by their textures and colors, combining them and just adding a few stitches. What I like to do is make a few in advance. I keep them in my stash, and then when I'm working on something, if I need a focal point or an element I'm not sure of, I can dig through these little stitch scraps, and I come up with something to add to my work. And I find it very helpful, and I hope you will too. So to use my scraps to make little elements that I want to put on my slow stitching pieces, I'll do this a couple of times. I'll do this if I have a bunch of scraps. I'll do this if I don't have a lot of time, and I'll do this to spark my own creativity. So here are just the little scraps, and these are just some ideas for you. I basically took tiny little bits of fabric, combined them either by color or because I like the two fabrics together, either the texture, the patterns, and then I stitched them just to one another. So this was just a simple piece of this gray fabric folded over. Then I added stitches back and forth. So this gives me another element to work with. With this one, I have two pieces of fabric. I cut one down to size so it's just smaller than this red background piece. And then I just made a stem stitch, adhering them together. Now they're very simple little pieces. For this one, I folded this beige fabric in half and added a straight stitch right here. And I have a little interesting piece. It's by no means complete, but it is another level of interest that I can add to my slow stitching pieces. For this one, I added more of a little ruffle fold, stitched it down, and I have an element here, and I purposely left this top part longer than this bottom part. So now I'll show you my process for creating these little scrap swatches. I keep my tiny little scraps in just a little plastic tub. I sort them by size every now and again. They're not always this neat. But as you can see, I have them sorted here by approximate size. So this is about the largest scrap I keep in this tub. I have larger scraps that I keep elsewhere. But for the project today, because I don't have a specific purpose in mind, I'm going to start by just making another fabric scrap. And I'll do this if I'm feeling creative, but I don't really know what to do, and I still want to sew. So I'll go through my scraps and combine 2 or 3 pieces of fabric together based solely on the looks of the fabric. In terms of size, I just choose something that speaks to me. I think I'll use this dark piece as the background piece, and I have all my long strips here together. I have my shorter strips here, and then these square pieces here. So now I'll just look through and see what speaks to me. It might be a single piece of fabric. It might be multiple pieces that I want to combine to make something interesting on that piece. So right there, the beige is speaking to me, and I'll use that. And then the black will tie that all together. So I'm just auditioning my pieces at this point. I can go through my scraps, seeing what I have that I like the look of, and just combining them. So once I have the pieces I want to work with, I'll put these aside. I no longer need them for today. And now I'll just determine how I want my placement to be. I have my long background piece, and I can cut this down to size if I don't want to use the entire piece, but I think I will use the entire piece. And now I'll just play around, cutting up some pieces, folding them, just combining them with my existing piece here. Maybe I'll let it overhang. Then I'll take a little bit of this black and white piece, trim it down, and then combine it just like that. So now I'll choose thread to stitch this down. It can be any color I want. I can introduce a new color, or I can continue with the beige and the browns. I'm going to take a little of this DMC pearl, thread a needle, and just start stitching. Now, because I don't have anything in mind and I'm not trying to match or complement an existing piece of fabric, and I have complete freedom to do whatever stitches, whatever colors, whatever texture I want. If I'm trying to coordinate with an existing piece of stitching, then I'll change it accordingly. So I'll put a couple of pins just to hold my piece in place, and I still can move them around if I don't like the way they're looking. And if I want to add more, I can do that. And if I want to cut more, I can do that as well. And now I just stitch. And this is something I can do in front of the TV, or I can do in the car. I just stick this in a little travel bag with my threaded needle, and I can do this while I'm waiting in the car. I'll just stitch a few stitches to hold everything down, and then I can decide on what decorative stitches I want to add. So once I have everything tacked down, I can decide if I want to add interesting stitches to this or just leave it like this so that I can use it further. Now, what I mean by it's not completely done is I purposely didn't add a lot of stitching because I know I'm going to adhere this by sewing it down onto an already stitched fabric piece at some point. There may be a particular color or shape or pattern that I really like, and I can choose from the already existed swatches from there. Now I want to show you how I use the swatch and how I attach it to an existing piece of slow stitching. So I have this little slow stitching piece. It wasn't done yet, but I do like what I've done and how I've started by making the fabric collage in the background and then adding different elements. I sewed this little fabric swatch because it picks up the colors from this piece, and now I want to stitch it down. And as you can see on this piece, I had overhang on my fabric pieces because I think that adds interest, and it echoes some of the qualities I already have. So now what I'll do is I'll thread my needle in the appropriate color, and so when I start stitching it down, I'll add more stitches, which will add more texture to my piece. So I just took some cotton pearl here, an 8, in the ecru color, the nice soft beige, and I set my swatch right where I want it to go. I'll put a pin to hold it in place, but I'm not too concerned about it shifting. And then I'll just start by tacking it down. I have very light thread, and I'll just make little small stitches to hold it in place. So I have one on my actual swatch, and I'm going to slowly add stitches on my other elements here. And I'm just making little stitches to adhere it down, to add a little texture, and to make the piece speak to me. So the stitches I add will vary with each project. I'll continue tacking it down with just little stitches all the way around, and then we'll take a look at the finished piece. So here I have my finished piece where I took my existing fabric swatch that I created in this step and combined it onto my piece of slow stitching. So it adds a completely different element, and it allows me to build up my stash with additional supplies to enhance my slow stitching. Now I can add these to a fabric book, to a bookmark, or to any piece that I want to slow stitch. I hope you found this way to use your fabric scraps as helpful, but also useful in your work. It's a great way to reuse scraps that you love and you don't want to part with, and also one way to keep up your creative energy. Thanks for joining me.